if you've always believed that Lucifer was the Lord of Hell's given name from the very dawn of creation, then congratulations, you've been led by the nose by one of the most spectacular translation scams in religious history. Imagine this, you are a prophet writing a satirical piece to poke fun at an arrogant Babylonian king, comparing his hubris to the morning star, glorious at dawn but extinguished once the sun rises. The whole thing was supposed to be nothing more than a political diss track for the ages, until ancient translators stepped in to flex their pens. From a common Latin noun meaning light bringer, yes, the word Lucifer itself, it was kneaded, distorted, and sautéed into a mess with a dozen other patchwork legends. Then, boom, from an innocent planet Venus in the sky, from a metaphor reeking of ancient trolling, Lucifer was forced into the ultimate frame job as the personification of evil, a fallen angel carrying all of humanity's darkest sins. Ironically, there was a time when devout believers used this very word, Lucifer, to praise Christ. Can you believe the hypocrisy of language? So, what actually happened behind the velvet curtain of those expensive, hand-copied scriptures? Who turned an astronomical phenomenon into the greatest psychological trash can for humans to dump their own evil into? Welcome to dark history. I am Zorro. Set aside those sleep-inducing sermons, because today we are dragging the naked truth out of the swamp of century-old mistakes. Do you smell it? The scent of cheap, half-burnt candle wax, the smell of mildew, the scent of animal hide being peeled, scraped, and soaked until it becomes expensive parchment, and the smell of a coincidence so ridiculous, it's cruel. Tonight, we will dissect one of the greatest jokes history ever played on humanity. A joke that didn't stem from bloody wars or deep conspiracies, but from a man who was sleepy and just wanted to finish his work. Look at him. An anonymous Latin scribe in a stone room, cold to the bone, in the Middle Ages. Tonight, his task is simple, repetitive, and tedious. Copy a passage from the open Bible, specifically from the book of Isaiah. It is a passage dripping with sarcasm, mocking a mortal monarch who dared to climb too high only to fall face first into the mud. But right in the middle of those mocking lines, our scribe pauses. The original text uses a metaphor, the morning star. To translate it, he needs a Latin word, a common word, a cheap one, as familiar as the dry bread he chews every morning. And so, with a steady flick of his wrist, the nib touches the surface of the page. Lucifer, the light bringer. Yes, you didn't hear that wrong. Tonight, in this tiny room, Lucifer is just a common noun, harmless, empty. This scrawny man has no idea that centuries later, the string of characters he just carefully scripted will become the name of the Lord of Hell, the name of the devil, of the greatest enemy in the universe. History, you see, is sometimes decided not by gods or great minds. It is decided by craftsmen trying to keep their margins straight. The book in front of him is a fortune. Each sheet of parchment cost hours of back-breaking labor and the skin of more than one animal. Faint lines mark where the text will run. He reads from the master copy, holds the phrase in his mind, and fits each new Latin word into that grid. Scraping away a mistake would scar the line and weaken the skin, so every stroke of the pen is a gamble. He checks the spacing. The margins are safe. He sighs in relief and moves to the next phrase. To him, the word Lucifer in that sentence is as equal as any other word. It merely refers to a bright object that appears before dawn and dies young when the sun rises. Outside that narrow window, that bright object actually exists. Venus. It is approaching its maximum brightness, arrogant enough to cast a faint shadow on the cold stone on a clear night. Out there, peasants are waking up to go to the fields. Guards are shivering and cursing during the final shift. Weary travelers. They all look up and have their own folk names for it, but not one of them stands behind this scribe to tell him, and he will never hear their voices. In this room, on this page, in this language of power, Lucifer is a sealed label. You know what the funniest thing is? This scribe wasn't debating angels or demons while he worked. His head didn't contain fiery holy wars or fallen angels with broken wings. His task was much more pragmatic. Match phrase to phrase, line to line, and try to keep the manuscript clean so he wouldn't get whipped by his superiors. But the great tragedy of language lies in the distance. The distance between what he intended to write and what those who read it later decided to believe. From the perspective of generations of fanatical readers hundreds of years later, this ordinary word used to mock a snobbish king accidentally acted as a singularity. It was the moment when a bright star in the sky, a fallen king on the earth, and an enemy of the universe began to be reshaped, melted down, and cast into a single name. As the last candle burns out, the ink on the page remains. This manuscript will be packed. It will leave this cold room, pass through other hands, fall into other interpretive minds, and cross other blood-stained centuries. Shake off the musty smell of the Middle Ages. To understand what that damn scribe just wrote, we have to go back even further. Further than shiny Latin vocabulary, further than gold-leafed Bibles. We are returning to the age of mud, of blood, and of mortal eyes, looking up at the sky with a mix of fear and worship. Imagine you are standing on a barren piece of land thousands of years ago. You stand there long enough, waiting for the sun to rise. The gray light begins to swallow the night, sweeping every star from the firmament, except for one stubborn holdout. It rises low in the east, insolently bright, more dazzling than anything else the human eye can see, as if it were trying to challenge the sun itself. The farmer, wiping sweat from his brow, recognizes it as he carries his plow to the field. The guard, leaning against the stone wall, yawning through his last watch, sees it too. And of course, the priests in white robes, standing atop massive ziggurats smelling of incense, have their eyes glued to it. To them, the Lightbringer was not a harmless name tucked away in a line of text. It was a living entity, a brilliant wanderer that constantly haunted an extremely dangerous sector of the sky, right at the edge of the day where light and darkness do battle. But this star, it had a very peculiar habit. It was completely unreliable. Some mornings it was there, proud and radiant. Then, on other mornings, it evaporated without a trace. It would disappear for weeks, for months, leaving the sky empty, then suddenly return as if it had never left. The astronomical truth behind this magic trick? It's boringly simple, but back then, people didn't have telescopes to realize it. You and I both know it's Venus, a ball of molten rock orbiting the sun in a narrower path than Earth. From our lowly perspective on the ground, this planet is like a dog leashed to the sun. It can never run too far away. It swings to the left, slides back, ducks behind, or glides in front of the sun, and then looms large on the other side. But to the mortal eyes of ancient humans, that spinning rock was a perfect scam. For months, this star rises right before the sun in the east like a great herald. Then it vanishes. A while later, boom! An identical glow appears in the west after the sun sets, and humans, with their naive instinct for storytelling, fell straight into this optical trap. Their language began to bend to the deception of their retinas. They split the object in two names, two fates. The universe's first case of multiple personality disorder was born. One brings the day, tearing through the dark like a glorious messenger. The other draws the curtain on the day, hanging in the western sky like a brilliant final sigh before the darkness swallows everything. In Greece, their rich imagination turned these two shadows into two distinct characters. The one appearing in the morning was Phosphoros. The evening wanderer was Hesperos. And in bloody Mesopotamia, they played it much bigger. Both these points of light belonged to a powerful, cruel, and impulsive goddess, a star that ruled both carnal love and barbaric wars, love and death. Rising in the morning, setting in the evening, they always go hand in hand, don't they? But regardless of who it was, every appearance of this light birthed new titles, new legends. But remember this: history never forgives ambiguity forever. There are always those who like to dig. The experts of sky watching, shaven-headed priests, philosophers stroking their beards in thought, began to notice something was off. In the clear dawns, a priest on a temple roof would carefully line up a row of stones to mark where the star rose. By dusk, he would notch a railing where it set. The first rising, the last rising, the first setting, the last setting. Day after day, year after year, they pressed that dry data onto clay tablets. And then, from those soulless numbers, a terrifying truth rose from the ground, a truth that the villagers arguing in the fields could never see. The gaps of time, the rhythms of rising and setting, the ranges of movement along the horizon, they all matched perfectly. The morning star and the evening star. They danced to the same biological rhythm. It required thinking ahead of its time to dare utter this blasphemous truth. Those 2 points of light, the radiant messenger of dawn and the melancholy period mark of dusk, were actually a single impostor. Just one celestial body following a single path around the sun. A few Greek philosophers dared to make that leap. But you know humans. They love their myths more than cold facts. The masses stubbornly called it by 2 different names. Old habits die hard. One to start the day, one to close it. Why am I telling you such a long astronomy lesson? pay attention because this is the pivot. It was this very deadly ambiguity, two names, one body, that laid out a perfect banquet for later writers and prophets. They needed an image. They needed a metaphor. And what could be more perfect than a proud, arrogant star rising dazzlingly before the sun, only to be immediately after swallowed and mercilessly erased by the sun's even greater light? It was the pinnacle of hubris and the fall. Long before our miserable Latin scribe fixed the name Lucifer onto the parchment, this planet had already nested in the human psyche. It was no longer an inanimate rock. It was a cunning, wandering light that seemed to constantly change its identity, appearing and disappearing, but in reality was bound to a cold, unforgiving mathematical cycle. The bomb was set. The gunpowder of legend was loaded. Now, all it needed was a fuse, a human king who happened to be arrogant and a sharp Hebrew poet. Destruction was about to begin. Before our sleepy scribe nailed the name Lucifer to the parchment, that morning star wasn't exactly unemployed. Oh no, it was very busy. Under the skies of the ancient world, it had managed to collect a long resume for itself, soaked in blood, lust, and power. Look at the first cities of humanity. Along the Tigris and Euphrates, that wandering light near the sun didn't belong to men. It was the exclusive domain of a goddess, Inanna. Or later, as the conquerors called her, Ishtar, the eight-pointed star, the royal seal of Inanna. Mesopotamian priests climbed the steep steps of the great ziggurats, straining their eyes to see this star rise before dawn or hang in the west at twilight. To them, it was the eye of the goddess, a goddess who ruled over wild sects and massacres on the battlefield. She made kings, and she was the one who crushed them. Do you see the familiar human habit? When we see something brilliant yet fleeting, we immediately assign it the power to manipulate life and death. On the sweat-soaked clay tablets of the Akkadians, this star was called Dilbat. It wasn't just a celestial body. It was a schedule of disasters. Its appearance predicted withered crops, breached borders, or the king's head about to leave his shoulders. But there is a detail hidden in Sumerian mythology that would later become the nail in history's coffin. It is the story of Inanna descending into the underworld. She leaves her radiant throne in the sky, enters the darkness, is stripped of all glory, and dies, rotting down there. The world above sinks into misery until she is resurrected and returns. Sound familiar? It is a perfect reflection of Venus's disappearing and reappearing habit, radiant at the peak, disappearing into death, then reborn, a cycle of status, pride, risk, and recovery. And this model began to spread like a virus. Further west, Semitic peoples began to whisper about a shining entity called the offspring of the dawn, one who reached too high, eyeing the throne of the supreme gods, only to be grabbed by the neck and thrown straight into the filth with lowly creatures. The more dazzling the peak, the more bone-shattering the fall. In Greece and Rome, the language split into two halves. They had Vesper for the melancholy evening star, and guessed the name for the radiant morning star that heralded the new day. Yes, it was Lucifer. Even, and this is the nauseatingly ironic part that I bet many would want to bury, Early Christians used the word Lucifer in an extremely positive way. They borrowed the image of the morning star dispelling the darkness to designate Christ himself. You see, a perfect, sharp, flexible tool. The language of the morning star was like a weapon honed for centuries, just waiting for someone ruthless enough to draw it from its scabbard. And that person appeared. A Hebrew prophet. But his target was no deity. His target was someone made of flesh and blood, the king of Babylon. Imagine Babylon, the most violent superpower of the ancient world, a machine that crushed nations, turned kings into slaves, and cut down thousand-year-old cedar forests to build war machines. This king of Babylon thought he was a god. He was the center of the universe. But in the book of Isaiah, the prophet composed the most toxic, most insidious diss track in literary history. He looked right into the face of that blood-drunk king and said, "You are going to fall." The poem doesn't describe a heroic battlefield scene. It drags the reader straight down to Sheol, the bottom of the abyss of death. A gray, cold place. And guess who is waiting for the king of Babylon there? Ghosts. The former kings of the nations he once slaughtered. They sit on rotting thrones in the darkness. As the soul of the Babylonian tyrant descends, they stand up in unison, not to welcome him, but to laugh. "Look," they say with bone-chilling sarcasm. "The one who once shook the whole world, is he now as weak as we are? The one who filled prisons, has he now joined the club of these rotting corpses?" In the realm of death, all power is leveled, king or beggar. All are just food for worms. And here, the decisive moment arrives. The blade of words is driven straight into the heart. The prophet calls that fallen king by a title, Hillel ben Shachar, Shining One, Son of the Dawn. Every mythological thread from thousands of years prior converges right at this line of poetry. The king is compared to the brilliant morning star appearing at the edge of the day. He had deluded himself with arrogant thoughts. He said in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven. I will set my throne higher than the stars of God. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far north." He didn't want to be a man. He wanted to wedge himself into the council of supreme powers, but the poem gives him no time to breathe. In the very next line, the direction is brutally reversed. There is no ascension, only a vertical plunge from the heights of the sky, crashing down to the bottom of the abyss. No state funeral, no mummified tomb. The body once wrapped in silk and gold now lies discarded on the ground like the carcass of a stray dog. His bed is a swarm of crawling maggots, and the soft blanket draped over him is a layer of earthworms. Absolute disgrace. Megalomania cured by nature's most radical method, decomposition. To ancient listeners, an unburied body, exposed for maggots to gnaw on, was a pain and humiliation far beyond any physical death. Do you see the structure of the trap yet? The king of Babylon was just a man, and this prophecy was only aimed at a flesh and blood dictator. There was no demon in the original text of this poem. The stars, heaven, the abyss, all were just satirical metaphors for his filthy political ambition. But, oh humans, with our complex nature and craving for drama, the combination of the morning star image, the one who tries to usurp God, and the plunge into the abyss of hell created a design that was too perfect, too haunting. It was like a blockbuster movie script with the skeleton already written. Later, theologians and translators, reading through these bloody and arrogant lines, wouldn't be able to resist the temptation. They would refuse to believe this was just about a suffocated king. They would see something bigger, darker, much more non-human hiding behind the shadow of this poem. And that, my friends, is when the word Lucifer began to change its identity forever. Have you ever played the game telephone? One person whispers into the ear of the next, and by the end of the line, a chicken has turned into a dragon. Welcome to humanity's greatest linguistic gamble. The gamble that accidentally sculpted the Lord of Hell. Let's follow our diss track against the king of Babylon. When it left the parched Near East and entered the shimmering Greek-speaking world of the Mediterranean, the Jewish translators of the Septuagint had to find a way to translate the phrase Hillel ben Shachar. They chose Heosphoros, the Dawnbringer, still very logical, still the language of the sky, still the insult of an arrogant tyrant falling from the heights into the abyss. But things started to go out of sync when the Bible moved further west, falling into the hands of Latin speakers. In the late 4th century, Jerome, a great scholar, and also a man who had perhaps drunk too much ancient coffee, set about creating the Vulgate. When he reached the Greek passage cursing the king named Heosphoros, Jerome chose a familiar Latin word, readily available, sitting prominently in the secular dictionary, to replace it. And boom, the pen touched the paper. That word was Lucifer. But here is the twist that will knock you sideways. At that time, Lucifer wasn't scary. In the earliest hymns, the word had an extremely positive meaning. The brilliant star that dispels the thick night. Early Christians even used the word Lucifer to refer to Christ. Imagine, on a Sunday morning over 1,000 years ago, you walked into a church and sang a song praising Lucifer, begging Lucifer to save your soul. What a satirical slap in the face to modern exorcists, right? At this point, the word was still flexible. It was as soft as candle wax, ready to be molded. But then, the complex minds of theologians got to work. You see, the professors and preachers of that time didn't like reading the Bible simply. They were trained to connect passages. They loved cosmic conspiracy theories. They called it typology. They looked at history and thought, there's no way this is just about mortal kings. There must be some power pulling the strings behind them. And so they began to pin bloody clues to their investigation board. Clue number 1, the book of Isaiah. Arrogant Lucifer rising from the dawn, wanting to set his throne above the stars, then getting kicked into the abyss. Clue number 2, the book of Ezekiel, cursing the king of Tyre. But the prophet uses the image of one who once walked in the Garden of Eden, covered in jewels, serving near the sacred fire, before being expelled in wretched disgrace. And to complete this cocktail, they poured in 2 shots of strong wine from the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke. Jesus claims to see Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. The book of Revelation. A giant dragon is thrown from heaven after a bloody civil war among the stars. When you put all those fragments together, what do you get? You create a Frankenstein's devil. Early Christian scholars took a piece of the Babylonian king, a piece of the tyrant of Tyre, a lightning bolt from Luke, and dragon scales from Revelation. They sewed them all together. Political mockery was now transformed into a window, into a rebellion on a cosmic scale. This new character needed a resume, so he became the most perfect creation, the brightest angel carrying the light of God. His motive? Blind pride. He wouldn't accept his place. He wanted to climb onto the supreme throne, and the price to pay was an eternal fall. And this great tragic character, the non-human rebellious spirit who dragged down a third of the falling stars with him, needed a proper name. The translation chain from Hillel to Hiosphorus, then to Lucifer, provided the linguistic bridge. The patchwork of prophecies provided the plot bridge. The candle wax had hardened. The common noun had petrified into a proper noun. The light bringer of the dawn was locked into the role of the Lord of Darkness forever. The clergy of that time used this story not to scare children, but to warn themselves. They taught each other that advancement in the church and trust in one's own brilliance and status could turn a priest in white robes into a demon. That pride is the gate leading straight to the abyss. But in the effort to create a moral lesson about pride, they accidentally performed the greatest linguistic usurpation. They stole a star from the sky, stripped a brilliant position from nature, and turned it into the ultimate symbol of evil. You think you know Lucifer? I bet right now your mind is picturing a red giant with horns, holding a pitchfork, laughing savagely amidst the boiling lakes of fire in hell. Or, if you have a bit more literary taste, you're thinking of a beautiful but arrogant, fallen angel who dared point a finger at the Creator and scream, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Let's turn back the clock to the beginning. The name Lucifer itself didn't smell of sulfur or the screams of damned souls. To ancient listeners, its meaning depended entirely on context and tone. The word Lucifer comes from Latin meaning simply light bringer, or the morning star, the brightest star that signals dawn tearing through the night. So why was a great symbol of dawn dragged down into the deep pit of countless sins? It all started with the greatest identity confusion in the history of texts. When chapter 14 of Isaiah was dissected by medieval scribes and scholars and patched together with various other passages, a translation and interpretation accident occurred. Through some magical feat of patchwork thinking, the king of Babylon, the arrogant prince of Tyre, the giant dragon in Revelation, and Satan the devil were all kneaded, crushed, and recast into a single entity. By the end of late antiquity, this intellectual laziness had become a familiar path. Medieval painters and scribes could close their eyes and draw the marginalia of their manuscripts. A radiant figure being hurled from the clouds of heaven, followed by a swarming horde with a brief judgmental caption, "Lucifer." Boom. That was it. The origin of evil. the danger of pride, the fall of the angel, all explained neatly in one character. Subsequent generations swallowed this image whole, convinced it had always existed this way since the dawn of time, never knowing that the story of the Lord of Hell was actually a Frankenstein work stitched together from detached fragments of text and ancient astral imagery. But here is where the historical twist appears, and it is a slap in the face to rigid dogmas. While preachers on their pulpits were straining their necks to warn the laity about the pride of the demon Lucifer, in another branch of tradition, the language of the morning star followed a trajectory that was grand and terrifyingly holy. New Testament texts speak of a star rising after the darkness, and do you know who they were referring to? Not Satan. They were talking about Christ. Jesus, in the final lines of the book of Revelation, claims himself to be the bright morning star. When Latin translators set about their work, faced with the term morning star or light bringer in Greek, which word did they choose? Yes, you guessed it. Lucifer. Picture this scene. The Easter Vigil in Western churches of that time. Darkness hangs thick over the entire cathedral space. The scent of incense lingers in the chill of the stone. Right at the center, a single tall candle burns brilliantly. The sound that breaks the silence is the Exulte hymn in Latin, resounding and authoritative. Near the end of the proclamation, the priest turns toward the breaking dawn and chants a plea for a morning star that never sets. That morning star is the symbol of resurrection, a victory over death. And the words sung out in the middle of that sacred cathedral vault, honoring Christ, was Lucifer. For hundreds of years, millions of devout believers knelt, listened to the ringing bells, welcomed the first rays of dawn through stained glass windows, and accepted the word Lucifer as a miracle of resurrection. In that moment, Lucifer was not the enemy. Lucifer was hope. Lucifer was the end of a dark old era and the turning point of time. The sound resonated without needing a single justification, without a glossary of terms. Context mastered the meaning. There, Lucifer belonged to the true light. So there you have it, friends. History is a crazy stage where a single word can live two completely opposite lives. Imagine an ancient parchment manuscript. In the main text column is the Bible. In the left margin is a hand-drawn illustration of the demon Lucifer falling into hell by a monk to warn against pride. And in the liturgical appendix on the right, people are singing praises to Christ as the Lucifer that never sets. That page did not burst into flames because of the contradiction. It contained both. It shows how language is bent by the different needs of humans. One side needs a ghost to scare and control pride. The other needs a symbol of light to cling to after long nights of despair. But humans, with our curiosity and obsession with darkness, rarely remember the good things. Folk imagination was gradually mesmerized by the smell of blood and fire. Folk plays and oral traditions began to dramatize evil, and the name Lucifer was gradually stripped of its resurrection glow, leaving only the flesh and skin of a fallen demon. We today stand at the end of a tunnel of time that is too long, receiving a word that has been swapped out and only remembering half the truth. And as the shadow of this word began to swell, it needed a place to reign, not suspended between the heavens, but in the deepest, coldest place of damnation, the place where a genius Italian man drew him an eternal prison. What do you think hell looks like? A giant incinerator reeking of sulfur with pitchfork-wielding demons constantly poking the backsides of sinners? Well, Hollywood and popular imagination have played a mean trick on you. Let me lead you down to the deepest level of true damnation. There is no fire there. There is only bone-chilling cold and the deathly silence of a failure. By the beginning of the 14th century, the image of Lucifer had completely shed the light of the morning star to settle into a map drawn with meticulous detail by an Italian genius, Dante Alighieri. In his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, Dante didn't just write poetry, he acted as an architect, an urban planner of the afterlife. He presented hell not as a chaotic trash heap, but as a giant funnel carved deep beneath the earth's surface, narrowing and darkening as it descends through circles of increasingly repulsive sins. In the outermost circles are lust and greed. Deeper in, you encounter violence and fraud. And at the very bottom of this structure, at the center of the world, the gravitational point for the filthiest betrayals, Dante placed Lucifer. The radiant morning star that once proudly rose at the edge of dawn is now suspended motionless. He is locked in a dark lake of ice at the point furthest from divine light possible. Imagine walking with Dante into the final stanzas of the Inferno. You huddle in the skin-piercing cold. Before you is not a roaring demon or one with a cunning smirk. No. You look up. Your jaw drops. Because before you is a giant who is silent. His height makes the tallest mountains on earth look like toys. But oh, the irony of fate. This lord is buried in ice from the chest down. He cannot walk. He cannot swing a sword. The greatest prisoner of hell is completely immobile. You see, Dante was a master of biting irony. He stripped Lucifer of his voice. His three monstrous faces are huddled together in a mockery, a distorted response to the Holy Trinity. The giant wings on his back, the pathetic remnants of his once brilliant angelic nature, still flap. But they flap in a mechanical, soulless motion like a trapped giant bat. And here is the cruelest twist. The very draft created by those desperate wings becomes the freezing wind that continuously freezes the lake around him. The more he struggles, the more fortified his prison becomes. Ironically, the one who once shone brightest in heaven has turned into a giant air conditioner powered by hatred, imprisoning himself. His jaws work in a barbaric rhythm, incessantly chewing the three greatest traitors in human history without ever stopping. Let's slow down for a moment here. Don't just look at the surface horror. These details from Dante weren't meant to scare children. They are a chillingly sharp theological and moral verdict. This isn't a scene copied from the Bible. Dante collected fragmented ideas about pride, alienation from God, and the atrophy of love, and kneaded them into a single portrait of paralysis. Reflect on that. Evil is not the ultimate power. Evil is absolute impotence. The entity once associated with the speed of light and ultimate freedom has become a clunky, heavy focal point of ice. Supreme power is now reduced to a blind, repetitive movement. Dante even linked this character to the very shape of the earth. In his grand and wild cosmology, Lucifer's headlong fall from heaven devastated the planet's structure. That impact gouged a deep hole, creating the funnel of hell, and The earthen rock displaced to the other hemisphere rose up to become the mountain of purgatory. Do you see? The lowest point in geographic space perfectly coincides with the lowest point in the moral order. A historical angelic catastrophe left a permanent geographic scar on the body of creation. Hubris left an indelible dent. However, how would a medieval peasant know how to read Dante's poetry? Naturally, common communities needed something more visual to consume their fear. Stepping out of academic pages, Lucifer donned personas suitable for public performances. This was the era of mystery plays. Imagine muddy town squares or noisy church courtyards. Poor actors donned exaggerated costumes, wore horned masks, screamed and danced wildly like little imps, lurking around a large, prominent figure, their leader. On church walls or carved reliefs, you would see a giant, devious silhouette standing next to a gaping hell mouth with jagged teeth, while minor demons used pitchforks to toss the damned into the flames. It was these folk stages and drawings that took Dante's complex theology and the elite's dry sermons, put them in a blender, and compressed them into an instant visual spectacle, easy to understand and grasp in an instant. Through these heavily religious entertainment mediums, the character of Lucifer was nailed into a stable visual identity in the imagination of all Europe. He had to stand in the deepest place. He was surrounded by ice or red fire, depending on which effect local stage directors preferred. In Dante's world, he was merely a dull punishment machine. Yet, in the eyes of the commoners watching the play in the square, the sight of a giant demon perched at the center of the underworld exuded a sense of dominion. They saw him not as a prisoner, but as a dark king. At this point, the name Morning Star, the poems praising the dawn, or the ancient royal mockery had officially faded from the minds of the masses. The audience was left with only one vivid and violent picture: a giant fallen angel, the ultimate endpoint of pride. Subsequent centuries obediently inherited this image, using it as material to mold countless paintings, plays, and later blockbuster movies. They used it like a ready-made item, never knowing how many threads of lies history had to weave, or how many texts it had to patch together to force the morning star to sit on that miserable throne. You think Dante's ice and silence were the worst punishments? Oh no. Silence only turns a villain into a harmless statue. For a devil to truly become dangerous, you must give him humanity's most fearsome weapon: words. And in the 17th century, a blind Englishman did exactly that. Amidst the smoking ruins and the mad political upheaval of the English Civil War, John Milton picked up his pen and wrote Paradise Lost. If Dante was the architect who built the prison of hell, Milton was the brilliant director who turned that prison into a grand, epic stage. Imagine floating on an ocean of boiling lava, so hot the very air catches fire. The Great War in heaven is over. The rebel forces have been crushed and hurled into the abyss. There, stretched out across the lake of fire, is Satan and his legions. Fatally wounded, exhausted, tasting an irreversible defeat. But instead of leaving the Lord of Hell stuck in ice like a pathetic bug, what is the first task Milton gives him? He gives him a voice. Satan slowly opens his eyes. He awakens. his giant frame rising like a great sea monster parting waves of lava. He calls his lieutenant, Beelzebub, and casts his gaze across his new kingdom of punishment. He knows the hand has been played. He admits that power has shifted, that the Creator possesses overwhelming physical strength, and that violent attacks will lead nowhere. But does he bow his head? Not a chance. His voice rings out amidst the fire, refusing surrender. He frames his humiliating defeat as merely a temporary change in tactics. He declares that the will to resist, the ultimate freedom of reason, will never be extinguished. It is a deadly combination of a clear political mind and an unbreakable, megalomaniac pride. It is the burning energy in those opening speeches that hooked the readers' minds, more vivid than anything else. He planted a mad but weighty thought in our heads: better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Under Milton's pen, hell is not an anarchic slaughterhouse. Around this central figure, an organized society of the fallen is built. The demons gather on the burning shore and build a magnificent dark palace called Pandemonium, the capital of hell. They organize a council. Do you see the irony here? The demons are holding a parliament. Each speaker offers a different strategy. One calls for a suicide bombing to restart the war. One advises lying low and biding time. Another proposes a campaign of covert sabotage. And Satan, he sits at the head, moderating the meeting like a veteran statesman. Finally, he volunteers for the most dangerous mission: to leave the inferno alone, fly through chaos, and infiltrate the newly created human world. He's no longer a mindless monster. He is a general, a diplomat, a symbol of rebellion. But it is when he lurks in the Garden of Eden that Milton truly shows us the psychological depths of the villain. Oh, he doesn't rush out to kill. He hides in the bushes, stalking Adam and Eve with a complex gaze, envy, contempt, but mixed with a painful, grudging admiration. He realizes what he has lost. The beauty of innocence tears at his heart, sharpening his resentment, and he chooses the lowliest but most effective revenge: temptation. Using no force, he slithers to Eve's side in the form of a serpent, using sweet words and the art of psychological manipulation to strangle an order he can never return to. However, Milton was too smart to allow evil a glorious ending. When Satan returns to hell, chests out, steps onto his throne, and loudly proclaims victory before the admiring eyes of the demon horde, that grand scene collapses in an instant. There is no applause, only a horrific hissing. He looks down and realizes with horror that his body is slithering on its belly. The entire hall of demons has been turned into a swarm of snakes. They rush to tear at illusions of fresh fruit, but all they chew is bitter ash, a punishment of ultimate irony. Those who chose to live by deception are now imprisoned in the very illusion of that lie. The grand spectacle shrinks into a tragedy of self-delusion. Nonetheless, the seed was sown. For later readers, especially during the Romantic period, the version of Lucifer/Satan standing proudly on the lake of fire, challenging supreme power, became a great tragic hero archetype. A romantic rebel daring to stand against an oppressive system. But while the artistic elite were busy romanticizing the Lord of Hell, in another dark corner of Europe, mages, clerics, and lawmakers were busy doing administrative paperwork for him. Yes, you heard right. Welcome to the bureaucratic era of hell. By the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period, as European state apparatuses were bloating with episcopal councils and complex official titles, grimoires and charms were also mass-produced. And guess what? Human imagination always reflects its own society. Hell, through the eyes of these ritual experts, was no longer a chaotic sea of fire or an icy cave. Hell at this time looked exactly like a multinational corporation or a European court. Lucifer, from a symbolic fallen morning star, was forced into a power suit, perched in the CEO position, or more accurately, the supreme emperor of the infernal hierarchy. Demonological catalogs like the Pseudo-Monarchia Demonum, the false kingdom of the demons, began to meticulously list every demon with names, ranks, and clear job descriptions, JD. Under Emperor Lucifer were managing directors like Beelzebub or Astaroth. Below them were dukes, marquises, counts, and legions of grunt soldiers. Each soul had a specialized role. Some were in charge of causing skin diseases, some dealt with granting mathematical knowledge, and others managed specific days of the week. The language of these magical handbooks mimicked legal formulas and bureaucratic paperwork, with sigils used as signatures for summoning contracts. You see, hell now possessed order, rank, and strict operating rules. Lucifer was no longer a wandering individual sowing pride. He was the anchor of authority for an entire dark administrative machine. These books were printed, circulated, and fell into the hands of preachers and judges. And this is exactly when things shifted from an academic joke to a truly bloody nightmare. When the shadow of this bureaucratic Lucifer slithered out of Latin pages to crawl into the villages, fields, and kitchens of illiterate peasants, it ignited one of the darkest and maddest chapters of human history. Are you ready to smell the stench of the burning pyres? Do you smell it yet? It's not the sulfur of the inferno. It's the acrid smell of burning human flesh rising from thousands of pyres across Europe throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And you know what the most ridiculous part is? The one lighting the fire wasn't the devil. The ones lighting the fire were officials and clerics in black robes, clutching the administrative manuals of hell that we discussed in the previous section. Welcome to humanity's maddest meat grinder, the witch trials. By this time, the dapper, bureaucratic Lucifer from the magical books had shed his aristocratic disguise to officially reach his greasy hands into every village, every barn, and every kitchen of the lowliest peasants. Imagine this. You are a poor, illiterate woman living off a moldy patch of garden at the edge of the village. Suddenly the weather turns, and a storm arrives to ruin the harvest. Or worse, the neighbor's cow suddenly drops dead, and the child next door catches a fever. In the Middle Ages, people called that bad luck. But in this era, thanks to the handbook Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of the Witches, published in the late 15th century, bad luck no longer existed. That damned book argued that witches weren't just weirdos doing petty magic. No! They were an organized terrorist network, a terrestrial HR branch, conducting coordinated sabotage campaigns under the direct guidance of the great brain named Lucifer. And so, boom, you are dragged to court. Look at the courtroom setting. On the high platform are fat-bellied judges and theologians with solemn faces, surrounded by thick Latin treatises. And you, standing trembling below, have absolutely no idea what's going on. The interrogations begin, and they follow a cruel script already written in the books. What stranger did you meet in the dark of night? You signed the black book in blood, didn't you? How did you swear allegiance to Lucifer? You think they care about the truth? Not at all. They are just filling in the blanks of an administrative declaration. If you deny the crime, the instruments of torture, the rack, the iron thumb screws, will do the talking. At the depths of pain, fear, and physical exhaustion, a person will say anything. Peasants screamed, mechanically repeating phrases they had overheard in the priest's deterrent sermons. Any anonymous man in black or night demon in their delirium was immediately captured by the court secretaries, who acted as filters and amplifiers, meticulously translated into Latin and scripted into the records with a single terrifying and academic name, Lucifer, and the machinery of public opinion began to turn. Cheap pamphlets printed in the local vernacular were flooded into the market, telling sensational stories to a bloodthirsty crowd. Shock! Peasant woman's signs packed with Lucifer surrenders soul in exchange for the ability to sour her neighbor's milk. With every edition printed, the link between petty neighborhood squabbles and the cosmic lord far away was tightened. In the most horrific mass panics, such as in the Würzburg and Bamberg regions of Germany in the early 17th century, accusations spread like a plague. One confession dragged dozens of others to the pyre, from children, clerics, and officials to vagrants. Every sentencing document was riddled with terms taken directly from demonology books, witch covens, lewd Sabbaths, and of course, at the top of the list, always Lucifer. The line between judicial paranoia and reality blurred. People worked with reverse logic. See a failed harvest? There must be an agent of Lucifer nearby. See bad weather? Lucifer's command. The one who was once the great morning star, once the embodiment of cosmic pride and epic poetry, was now pathetically demoted to a filthy gang leader. A man so bored he issued orders down to pigsties and kitchens just to annoy farmers. Finally, when the light of reason flickered and the waves of witch hunting began to subside, the pyres cooled and courts became more cautious. But do you think humanity apologized and gave the name back to the morning star? Don't be so naive. The demon Lucifer had permanently taken root in the human consciousness. In the era of the Catechism following the Council of Trent, both the Catholic and Protestant worlds simultaneously packaged this fear into pocket-sized lessons. Children and adults were forced to memorize fixed questions and answers. Who is our enemy? It is the devil. It is Lucifer. The complex demonological hierarchy was discarded, replaced by a more pragmatic image, a personal, invisible enemy who is always whispering in your ear, inciting you to neglect prayer, foster hatred, and break vows. In parish sermons, Lucifer was no longer Dante's frozen giant, nor Milton's romantic general. He became a daily stalker, the brilliant morning star that signaled the dawn of 1,000 years ago was dead, replaced forever by a dark ghost molded by human fear and bureaucracy. And that, my friends, is how history works. We take a word that means light bringer, star of dawn and resurrection. We drop it into a machine of translation errors, poetic fantasies, stereotypical bureaucracy, and finally the bloodthirsty paranoia of those in power. Through centuries of accumulation with lies and fear, the light has been completely dyed black. Have you ever accidentally told a lie? Or had a dark thought of envy toward your neighbor? In our time, that's just a normal psychological blip. But step back a few centuries, well, congratulations. You aren't just a person lacking willpower. You have officially joined the villainous side of a cosmic scale war. In dry sermons from marble pulpits, human moral decisions were framed with ruthless drama. On one side was service to the God of light. On the other was a blood contract with the dark adversary. By stuffing a scheming tempter into the corners of the mind, the church performed a wonderful feat. They turned the smallest, most mundane human failures into disasters of world-destroying proportions. You didn't steal because you were hungry. You stole because the devil was pulling your strings. One arrow hits two targets. It strips humans of their autonomy and creates a perfect common enemy. But how do you sell this fear to illiterate peasants, people who had never touched a theology book in their lives? Simple. Use pictures. Close your eyes and imagine standing in a noisy medieval fair, the smell of horse manure thick with the scent of cheap ink. In the shadows of massive cathedrals, people sold woodcuts, folk storybooks, and religious prints as common as vegetables. On those rough pages, the adversary was unmistakably portrayed. Sharp horns piercing the sky, devious tails, clawed feet scratching the earth, and great bat wings dragging screaming souls into the pits of flesh-licking flames. The crude captions beneath those pictures weren't for education. They screamed at the viewer about the cruel fate of the unrepentant. A few bold prints named names: Lucifer. Others used more generic titles. The art style was extremely primitive, intended only for fast printing and wide coverage. And you know what? This marketing campaign was a resounding success. Over time, a standard brand identity for the devil spread across Europe. A child in France could look at a print bought from Germany and scream in terror without needing to read half a word of the caption. But the invasion of fear didn't stop at the church doors or the squares. It crawled right into your bedroom. Inside families, living spaces were divided by the spatial symbols of heaven and hell. Look at the creaking wall next to that sleepy bed. A tiny holy icon depicting a guardian angel spreading wings to protect a child. But look closely at the edge of the frame. There is always a dark shadow waiting, a claw lurking. In the prayer books placed on the family dining table, the scene of the Last Judgment was laid out like a bloody theater. Christ reigning in the radiant center above, while demons happily chewed and dragged the damned below. These sights turned abstract dogmas into an oppressive spatial reality. The adversary was suddenly both infinitely distant in the 9 levels of Dante's hell, yet hair-raisingly close. He belonged to the invisible realm, yet his cold fingers touched every corner of the house, every patch of field, and every workshop. However, humans are interesting creatures. When fear is pushed to the limit, our greatest self-defense weapon is activated. Irony. Simultaneous with the threats from the church, folk skepticism and humor began to soften this monster. Around flickering fires, people began to whisper different stories. Tales of deals at lonely crossroads, where a clever peasant somehow managed to trick the devil. You want my soul? Fine. But first, build me a magnificent bridge across that churning river in a single night. And then, with a spectacular trick of language or timing, the dirt-poor peasant not only got his bridge, but also caused the Lord of Hell to lose his wages entirely, leaving in a huff. These jokes existed alongside the grave warnings from the pulpit. They showed us that humans yearned for another way to dialogue with the darkness, a way in which they were not completely helpless. By the time the 18th and early 19th centuries knocked on the door, everything had merged into a widely shared image in the minds of the masses. For many Christians, the main enemy was no longer a monster, frozen silent in the bottom of Dante's hell, nor an academic name lying dormant in theological commentaries. He was the boogeyman of childhood lessons. He was the one with bat wings printed on cheap paper. He was the excuse cited every time parents scolded or a priest gestured in threat. The complex bureaucratic layers of medieval demonology gradually retreated, giving way to a simple, pragmatic, and absolutely solid stereotype. A single personal adversary. A leader of lowly souls, constantly rubbing against and breaking the boundaries of daily life. In official texts, he was called by his noble title, Lucifer. In the language of the streets, he was the devil. He was Satan. This everyday version of the Lucifer image was the perfect seed. It had taken root deeply enough to create a familiarity that bordered on boredom. And that, my friends, was the golden moment for history to flip his face, preparing for one of the greatest reimaginings of human culture. We meet again. In the previous section, I showed you how the church turned a cosmic enemy into a cheap boogeyman to scare children and peasants. But history always has a sense of cruel irony, my friend. Just as theologians thought they had locked the devil tightly under thick layers of dogma, a bunch of artists with the craziest minds of the era arrived, kicked down the gates of hell, and dragged him out into the light. Welcome to the end of the 18th century. Take a deep breath. Do you smell that? It's the scent of gunpowder from revolutions, the blood of falling dynasties, and the smell of discontent surging across Europe. Kings were losing their thrones, and sometimes their heads. The old order was crumbling. The mood of an entire era was one of extreme bewilderment, but also a deep yearning for freedom. And in that suffocating atmosphere, the Romantic writers needed a symbol. They looked around and asked, who was the first to dare stand up against an absolute tyrannical power? Who was the one who would rather rule in hell than be a slave in heaven? The answer was too clear. They didn't need to invent a new character. They just needed to change the posture of one already too familiar. The first person to take a chainsaw to the chains of dogma was William Blake. If you met Blake in London at that time, you would see a craftsman engraver working diligently under flickering candlelight, molding works that sat on the line between genius and madness. In his legendary book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake made a spectacular table flip. He tossed angels and demons into a head-to-head debate. Angels were the dignified, rigid ones, representing dry, suffocating moral rules. And the devil? The devil was the voice of energy, of desire, and of pure creativity, things that always refused to be imprisoned in cramped cages. Blake didn't bother drawing horned demons lurking under the bed anymore. Just look at his illustrations. The fallen angels are sketched with rippling, muscular physiques, powerful movements, twisting amidst radiant flames. No longer a frozen despair, but a vitality so intense it was dazzling. A generation of readers accustomed to the devil being the dregs of the abyss now gaped to see that the devilish side was actually the source of all the most brilliant energy. The sin was still there, the fall was still there, but the emotional charge had completely reversed. Instead of fear, people began to feel admiration. And then the next generation stepped onto the scene. Make way for the true bad boys of English literature, Lord Byron and Percy Shelley. They inherited Blake's foundation, dragged John Milton's Paradise Lost out of the library, and turned the devil into a charismatic philosopher. In Byron's poetic play, Cain, a mystery, Lucifer appears not with roars or a pungent smell of sulfur. He appears as a learned gentleman, a calm guide. He leads Cain on a walk through the history of the universe, showing man the terrifying vastness of space and the death lurking in every corner. Listen to how he whispers into the audience's ear. He doesn't incite murder. He asks fatal questions. Where is the justice in this system when tiny beings must groan under the weight of suffering and death just because of a silly mistake made by their ancestors? You see, this tone is entirely a sharp philosophical debate. Byron's Lucifer is the image of one who refuses to kneel before power inherited without question. Shelley also followed suit by reshaping this rebel archetype through the figure of Prometheus, a being suffering cruel punishment from a cosmic tyrant, but with eyes still raised high in pride, refusing to submit. Pride, the thing once cursed by the church as the source of all sin, was now honored as the noblest dignity of free souls. Of course, conservative critics went mad. They tore their hair out, calling this group of writers by a derogatory name, the Satanic School. But the more they banned it, the more the crowds adored it. Young readers saw in these characters a reflection of the very struggles in their own hearts, the voice of conscience against dogmatic laws, the desire for freedom smashing the weight of tradition. From the ashes of demonology, a brilliant character archetype was born, the Byronic hero. You have surely seen this guy somewhere in modern movies or novels. He is extremely handsome or possesses a haunting appearance. He has passionate eloquence, a sharp vision, but is always shrouded by the dark shadow of a mysterious sin in his past. He detaches himself from a hypocritical society. He glides through elegant parlors, bloody battlefields, or personal scandals with the demeanor of a fallen morning star. Lonely, proud, and dangerous. At this point, in tea rooms and literary secret societies, if someone called you Luciferian, don't be quick to pull out your gloves for a challenge. It was no longer an insult. It was the most subtle compliment, implying that you were one of brilliant intellect, extremely bold, and possessed a lethal charm. the devil had been reborn. He was no longer the enemy of God in Sunday sermons. He had become the greatest artistic symbol of resistance. But the adventure of the name Lucifer didn't stop with the literary elite. As the 19th century arrived, this name would be tossed straight into the muddy alleys of street politics and the smoke-filled rooms of the occult. Are you still there? Good. Because if in the previous part we saw Lucifer proudly pacing through the velvet-lined parlors of the literary elite, he is now about to roll up his sleeves and step into the mud, push open the creaking oak doors of the 19th century. Welcome to the era of smoke-filled libraries, deafeningly loud printing presses, and street corners overflowing with resentment. This is the moment when the name Lucifer no longer rests solely within flashy epics or stays locked under children's beds. He is dragged onto a new battlefield: human intellect. It began in the incense-scented rooms of the occultists. Alongside the church's threatening sermons, a new kind of book began to creep onto wooden shelves: occult treatises, spiritual memoirs, and esoteric magazines. Those who read them were not devout parishioners. They were free thinkers, amateur scholars, and truth seekers tired of regurgitated dogma. They looked at the name Lucifer, traced its Latin roots back, and smirked. Lucifer meant light bearer, after all. Under the pens of occult writers like Eliphas Levi, scripture and myth were stripped down into a coded language of magic and imagination. Lucifer was no longer the name of a lord idly boiling oil in hell. He was transformed into a concept, a brilliant symbol of enlightenment, of intellectual daring, of the desire to tear through the veil of blind dogma. In esoteric drawings filled with tangled diagrams, Lucifer was stripped of his horns, tail, and crude pitchfork. He became a knot in a complex network of symbols linked to planets, metals, or the resonating notes of the universe. Curiosity and rebellion, things the church listed as deadly sins, were now dressed in a new suit by the occultists, the ultimate driver of spiritual evolution. And do you know the pinnacle of this provocation? In 1887, in foggy London, Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society nonchalantly launched a periodical. Its name was printed boldly, right on the cover: Lucifer. Imagine the pale faces of the priests and conservatives of that time. A public insult, a slap in the face to the church. They screamed that the occultists were openly dancing with the devil. But what was the most ironic and humorous truth? If you flipped open that Lucifer magazine, you wouldn't find a single necromancy spell or blood pact. It was filled with dry, dense essays on karma, mythological analysis, and critiques of dogma. It was boring and academic to the point of inducing sleep, but its name had done its job perfectly. It drew a clear line in the sand. It declared contempt for religious authority. But occultism was just a game for dreamy minds. Step out of those closed rooms and onto the streets, where the smell of cheap printer's ink and sour sweat mingle. Increased literacy and printing technology had handed weapons to the working class. Radical newspapers and broadsides plastered onto brick walls began to view religion not as a savior, but as a corrupt institution, blocking science, shackling the law, and stifling individual freedom to protect the interests of the elite. Editors and caricaturists needed a symbol heavy enough to smash hypocrisy in the face with a single glance. And guess who they chose? Exactly. Lucifer. Enter a poor workers' club. Men with faces smudged with coal dust, having just finished an exhausting 14-hour shift. They sit around a rough wooden table, drinking thin beer from chipped mugs, and pass around a radical newspaper. In the paper, the image of the devil is not hideous. On the contrary, it is a sharp satirical drawing. Fat priests in magnificent robes clutching bags of gold. They have their eyes squeezed shut, cowering in fear, running away from a muscular allegorical figure holding high a blazing torch. That torch bears the words reason, truth, and the name labeled on it, Lucifer. This rhetorical blade was perfectly sharp. If the church represented ignorance and censorship, then Lucifer was secular light, science and reason dispelling the stifling darkness. In these shabby spaces, Lucifer was the code for refusal, a refusal to kneel and ask for ridiculous explanations for their poverty and disease. The government and the church struck back in total panic. Police swarmed printing shops, seizing bundles of wet-inked newspapers. Preachers stood on pulpits, waving their arms and condemning social reformers as depraved Luciferians. They tried desperately to shove Lucifer back into the dark monster box of old. But it was too late. The scandal only added fuel to the fire. For radical journalists, being called a Luciferian was like receiving a Medal of Honor. It proved that their knives had struck the dark heart of power. The name that was once a morning star, then a fallen angel used to scare children, had now become a way of life, an open defiance attached to the longing for freedom. As the 19th century closed, history had created a beautiful Frankenstein monster named Lucifer. He carried within him the cruelty of dogma, the tragic romance of poetry, the intellectual light of the occult, and the fiery resentment of the bottom-tier working class. He was perfectly prepared, carefully packaged with the most complex meanings. Everything was just waiting for humanity's most powerful media weapon to be born to turn him into a true superstar. Throughout the chaotic timeline we have just flipped through, the devil has been a great shapeshifter. He was the boogeyman under the church's bed, the rebellious rock star of romantic poetry, and the fiery torch of the radical press. But how were all those complex, jagged pieces molded into a global symbol sitting prominently on your flat-screen TV? The answer lies in a new religion of the modern era, the entertainment industry. Step back a bit in time to the opera houses and stages of 19th century Europe. Before television was born, audiences were already well acquainted with a flamboyant devil named Mephistopheles in plays about Faust. Forget the monster smelling of sulfur. The devil on stage was a true artist. Under the pen of Goethe or in Gounod's opera, Mephistopheles appeared in brilliant red-accented costumes, completely in control. He glided through crowds with absolute confidence, dropping sharp remarks, mocking human vanity, and concluding every tragedy with a neat contract. Stage directors molded him with crafty tricks. A trapdoor flung open, a thick roll of smoke, sudden color-shifting lights, and boom, he stood there looking through the other actors to wink directly at the audience, exactly the way I'm talking to you right now. The audience learned an unconditional reflex. Whenever they saw a sudden streak of shadow and a knowing half-smile, They knew the spotlight stealer had arrived. Dogmatic theological context retreated to the wings. Overwhelming stage presence was what dominated. Then cinema was born. Who do you think was the first supernatural superstar of the silver screen? Not Dracula, not Frankenstein. It was him again. In the magical short films of Georges Méliès, the magician turned director, the devil was the perfect excuse to showcase special effects, disappearing, swelling, shrinking, moving furniture with jump cuts. Moving into the silent film era, the 1926 masterpiece Faust by F.W. Murnau pushed this imagery to a horrific and ornate peak. At the start of the film, he is a giant black shadow, spreading hideous bat wings to cover an entire town, spreading plague. But then, he shrinks down into a dapper-dressed man with elegant gestures and a supremely cynical smirk. The screen taught humanity a new visual language. Horns and capes are just work uniforms. The core of the devil lies in the demeanor. And when he migrated to America in the mid-20th century, well, he completely transformed to adapt to the American dream. In The Devil and Daniel Webster, there were no more crumpled parchments or cheesy blood oaths. The devil was now a cunning lawyer, wearing a crisp suit, speaking with a thick American accent, an off-the-shelf contract tucked under his arm, ready to solicit a desperate farmer. In musicals, the irony was pushed to its peak. The devil always had the best songs. The catchiest tunes, the most seductive dances, the humorous scenes exposing human hypocrisy, all belonged to him. The audience walked out of the theater whistling the tempter's melody. The moral warning was still there, but the audience's heart had been stolen by the villain long ago. Every layer of history, the pride of theology, the torment of romantic poetry, the craftiness of the stage, had converged. By the end of the 20th century, a full commercial name was stamped on his forehead: Lucifer Morningstar. In 1989, in Neil Gaiman's legendary comic series, The Sandman, Lucifer reappeared not as a roaring tyrant, but with the appearance of a young David Bowie, pale, elegant, terrifyingly calm, and extremely, extremely bored with governing hell. He did something no theologian could have predicted. He resigned. He slammed the gates of hell shut, chased out all the demons and damned souls, threw away the key, and left behind a cosmic war that had become tasteless. A silent, subtle rebellion that dealt a fatal blow to both heaven and hell. Soon after, the spin-off comic series Lucifer, penned by Mike Carey in 2000, took this former Lord of Hell to Los Angeles, the capital of temptation. Here, he opened a luxury piano bar named Lux. From a dark, dogmatic concept, Lucifer now stood behind a bar, pouring drinks and broodingly posing the greatest existential question. What is the meaning of free will when you were born only to be a pawn in the Creator's play? He was still ruthless, still infinitely powerful, but he acted according to a personal, inviolable set of rules. He escaped the narrow narrative cage of the Bible to become a multi-dimensional, complex, and utterly magnetic literary character. Finally, in 2016, popular television, Fox and later Netflix, grabbed this contract and created a global explosion. They kept Gaiman's premise. Lucifer leaves hell, goes to LA, and opens a nightclub. But they molded the rest into an urban fantasy crime series. Does it sound funny to you? the Lord of Hell, once described as the source of all human evil, now drives a shiny black Corvette, wears designer suits, and follows an LAPD homicide detective around to help the police solve crimes. He punishes evildoers not with boiling oil, but by staring into their eyes and asking, "What is it you truly desire?" The truth is, millions of people around the world have been glued to their screens to watch this devil get drunk, play the piano, go to a therapist to resolve daddy issues with the guy upstairs, and long to be loved. So there it is, friends. Look back at the road we have traveled. From a bat-winged monster dragging people into pits of fire in cheap medieval woodcuts, to a great rebel fighting for intellectual freedom. And finally, landing safely in your living room as a heartthrob, solving murders in Hollywood. Lucifer is not just the name of the devil. The evolution of this name is a mirror reflecting humanity itself. When we were afraid, we drew him with horns and claws. When we longed for freedom, we gave him proud wings and the torch of reason. When we are confused about personal identity in the modern world, we turn him into a lonely bar owner looking for the meaning of life. The church created the fear, but it was us, humans with infinite imagination, who created the character. Close your eyes for 3 seconds. When I say the word devil, what do you see? A towering monster, bright red skin, brandishing a pitchfork to poke groaning, sinful souls in a sea of fire? Or perhaps a freakish creature frozen at the bottom of hell, as the poet Dante once warned us? Open your eyes. If you live in the 21st century, perhaps the image flashing through your mind isn't a hideous monster. No, you probably imagined a tall Englishman wearing a shiny designer suit, holding a glass of whiskey, smiling enchantingly in a neon-lit nightclub. He leisurely strolls the streets of Los Angeles, flirtatiously charming, playing the piano skillfully, and, oh my, he goes to see a therapist to talk about his family trauma. Welcome to the greatest rebranding era in human history, the Whitewashing Lucifer campaign. In the modern world, the name Lucifer is no longer a curse whispered in fear. He has become the vulnerable, wounded protagonist in a long-running TV series. Modern scripts have molded the Lord of Hell into a part-time crime solver, entangled in silly family drama with other celestial entities. He sits on the soft sofa of a psych clinic talking incessantly about guilt, about resentment toward dad above, and wondering if someone like him can truly change. It turns out, the worst punishment for a fallen angel isn't an eternal lake of fire, but having to face a mess of adolescent emotional bubbles lasting several millennia. And you know the most ridiculous thing? We buy it. This version of Lucifer reaches a massive audience, far beyond the original comic readers. From television waves to global streaming platforms, he is subtitled and dubbed into dozens of languages. He calls himself the Devil, occasionally showing off some supernatural power, or revealing his wings. But basically, he is busy with loving, sulking, learning to trust, and carrying responsibility. Very human antics. Of course, the old marks of pride and the fall still lurk somewhere, but they have been squeezed into the framework of a soap opera, focusing on character psychology. And the Lucifer series isn't the only one doing this. Look at Supernatural, where Lucifer appears as an arrogant archangel, caught in the web of fate and free will. Or dive deeper into the world of video games and Japanese anime, where Lucifer often appears as a recruitable ally or a complex rival, a rebel against a rigid cosmic order rather than a purely evil Satan. Each of these fictional worlds sets its own rules, but they all saute the same recipe: a talented but fallen one, possessing intense beauty, lethal charisma, and a resume thick with conflict with the supreme board of directors. In this bustling cultural environment, the name Lucifer functions like an identification barcode. A viewer who never had to endure a sleepy sermon on the book of Isaiah, nor ever flipped a page of theology, immediately recognizes Lucifer Morningstar as a character type. He is an attractive, sharp, gray moral figure, a person who once strangled the throats of millions of souls in hell, now leisurely walks the city sidewalks in polished leather shoes. Merchandise, fan art, heated Reddit debates, all have poured concrete into this new identity. Advertising posters don't scare people with horns and tails anymore. They lure customers with a stylishly dressed man, hinting at a bit of supernatural mystery. The image of the devil from crude medieval woodcuts and dry early modern catechisms is still there, gathering dust in libraries. But the massive entertainment machine has pushed an entirely different picture to the front parlor of the public imagination. And here is the most spectacular scam. This rebranding has brainwashed us to the point that it even distorts the way we reread ancient documents. Imagine a modern youth who, after binging 3 seasons of The Handsome Devil Show, suddenly gets the urge to open the Bible, read Dante or Milton. They step into these ancient texts with a massive expectation of internal torment, of the lethal charm of a misunderstood bad boy. Meanwhile, ancient authors simply wanted to draw an irreconcilable enemy, a cruel accuser. Some young readers enjoy this disconnect, applying the lens of comics to ancient verses. Others frown in protest, trying to hold on to the traditional hideous devil image. But regardless of which side you're on, the entertainment industry has won by a landslide. They have ensured that the name Lucifer is no longer a dry theological concept. It is a vivid character with its own tone, fashion sense, and repetitive plot lines. It is a brand that makes money. From a Latin noun passing through ancient parchment rolls, slipping through centuries of shackled dogma, crossing Renaissance paintings and satirical newspapers, Lucifer has become an idol. However, my dear friend, when the TV screen flickers off, the real world out there interprets this name in a much darker and crazier way. Out there, Lucifer is not an actor smiling while waiting for his paycheck. Are you ready to step into the coldest prison cell of history? Put on a warm coat, because we are about to dissect the mortal corpse of the glamorous devil you just saw on TV. The truth is, modern devils pacing the stage, brandishing power in comics, or winking flirtatiously on television are not originals. No, they are Frankenstein monsters of popular culture, sewn together from the bloody flesh bits of every version of Lucifer that ever existed before. The audience sees a majestic character ruling hell, striking hammers to sign dark contracts, citing high-flung philosophies about freedom, and lingering in human entertainment spots. But hidden beneath that single polished image is a massive tower of ancient ruins. Take out the scalpel and peel back the first layer. Dante Alighieri. From Dante's Divine Comedy, modern screenwriters stole the core idea. The devil must reign at the very bottom of hell and claim supreme right over the damned. However, Hollywood handily threw the less attractive original details into the trash. In Dante's work, Lucifer is a pathetic traitor, permanently frozen in Lake Cocytus, with 3 faces chewing on other traitors in nearly absolute silence. Frozen, silent, and immobile. Think about it. How do you sell a toy model of a big guy stuck in a block of shaved ice? So pop culture swept that ice away. They rarely show an immobile monster. Instead, they turn hell into a kingdom with an entrance and exit, where the devil is a monarch who can leave the throne at will to stroll among humans. The responsibility to punish remains, but it's more like the job of a corporate CEO than a cosmic damnation. But a CEO cannot be silent. He needs to know how to speak. And that is when we graft on the second layer. John Milton. If you see a devil on film giving an eloquent speech, justifying his choices with sharp arguments that make you nod in agreement, well, that is the shadow of Milton in Paradise Lost. Milton gave the devil the most dangerous gift, fluency and self-awareness. He turned Lucifer into a tragic rebel general who complained about the injustice of heaven and ignited the fanatical fire of his followers. Later writers and screenwriters have brutally usurped this demeanor, even if they have never read the original. Modern screen devils speak with complete philosophical arguments. They play the role of the misunderstood victim, the one pushed into a corner, and view every dialogue with the side of good as an opportunity to display pride, shame, or ultimate resentment. The shiver of realizing the fallen one possesses a superior intellect, even overshadowing holy angels. It's all Milton's legacy. But a sharp intellect needs light to lead the way. And this is where the third layer appears: occult and theosophical texts. When esoteric movements restored the Latin Lucifer with its original meaning of light-bringer, they transformed him. They attached this name to enlightenment, inner knowledge, and the act of smashing rigid dogma. Have you noticed that devils surnamed Morning Star constantly drone on about truth, free will, and enjoy exposing the filthy secrets of humans? That is no coincidence, although lazy scripts never bother explaining the etymology of the name. The phrase Morning Star has implicitly signaled our subconscious. This guy is a representative of the light of knowledge, hanging at the threshold between the murky darkness and the awakening dawn. Finally, to create a true drifter, we sprinkle a little seasoning from 19th century radical and anti-clerical satirical press. These old newspapers and posters use the image of Luciferianism to mock the church's suffocating control over law and education. The result? Modern devils leisurely raising glasses in nightclubs, smirking at blindly religious people and treating sacred institutions with a nonchalant shrug. Their rebellion no longer carries the tone of an earth-shattering war, but rather like a sharp, stylish mockery aimed at the hypocrisy of human society. When all these jumbled pieces are stuffed together into a grinder, we get a character profile streamlined perfectly for the consumer era. A person who once ruled hell, possesses boundless knowledge, speaks enchantingly, walks freely, is proud, curious, and always ready to criticize both heaven and hell. Hell at this point could be a dungeon, a bureaucratic office, or a psychological state. It doesn't matter, as long as the central character maintains that aura. This flattening of history brings in massive profits. Producers don't need to laboriously build characters from scratch. They throw this template into crime films, romances, or urban comedies smoothly. The marketing department just needs to design a stylish black shadow, add some fire, wings, and the name Lucifer. Boom. The audience automatically pulls out their wallets. But my friend, every flattening has a price. When dozens of layers are compressed into one, the boundary of truth is blurred. We forget that the original passage in the book of Isaiah actually aimed to mock a flesh and blood foreign king. We ignore the fact that Dante's Lucifer was originally silent. Historical truth is strangled under the weight of entertainment. The image on the screen brings an ancient, sacred feeling. But in reality, his form owes more to centuries of fan fiction and reinterpretation than to any original text. And when this perfectly remixed version of Lucifer steps off the screen, it stands right at the threshold of a truly horrific war. Out there, religious movements, followers of Satanism, and conspiracy theorists are grabbing this very cultural ghost, molding it into sharp weapons for modern-day crusades. What are they doing with that name? Don't look away, because the real darkness has only just begun. Enough. Turn off the TV, throw the DVD aside, and step out of dreamy Hollywood. We are entering the real world where everything is more jumbled, crazier, and more soaked in paranoia than any movie script. You see, when the ghost of Lucifer lingers outside the screen, it splits into two extreme flows. One side is those who drape themselves in the devil's cloak to intimidate. The other side is those trembling behind keyboards, pointing at everything and screaming, "Devilish conspiracy." Both sides are squeezing the remixed Morning Star image we just dissected, but they drag it in directions that are heartbreakingly ridiculous. Let's start with those who call themselves family of the Inferno. In 1966, in a San Francisco overflowing with marijuana smoke and counterculture, a man named Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan. Sounds horrific, doesn't it? Are you imagining bloody sacrifices in a basement? You're dead wrong. LaVey's Satanism was a slap in the face to religious people. Its core was blatant atheism. For LaVey, Satan was not a sulfur-smelling entity with pointed horns, but merely a symbol of pride, carnality, and extreme individualism in a cold, meaningless universe. They borrowed tragic imagery from Milton, wore black robes, and concocted theatrical rituals just to shock, to mock Christian moral standards, and to honor the naked human ego. Basically, it was a club for humanists who liked wearing goth clothes and scaring the faint of heart. A few decades passed, and another more sophisticated gang appeared. The Satanic Temple, headquartered in Salem, yes, the very town of the infamous witch hunts. Active since 2013, this group doesn't bother with spells or sacrifices. They are the greatest pranksters of the American legal system. Claiming to be a non-theistic religion, they use Satan as a mascot for eternal rebellion against authoritarian rulers. What do you see the Satanic Temple busy doing? filing lawsuits for religious equality, fighting for reproductive rights, demanding the separation of church and state. They even brought a giant statue of the demon Baphomet to place next to the Ten Commandments monuments at government buildings, or opened after-school Satan clubs for children. Why? Not to teach kids to summon spirits, but to test if the legal system dares to treat a minority religion with an ear-piercing name equally. Satan, in their hands, has turned into a brilliant flag for civil rights activists. And then we have Luciferianism, a loose, esoteric, and somewhat more meditative network. They embrace the title Light Bringer. To them, Lucifer is the torch of intellect, of individual spiritual advancement, and the break from dogmatic chains. Some see it as a symbol, others revere it as a real entity. But overall, their language is of curiosity, independence, and enlightenment. All of this sounds very philosophical and deeply democratic, right? But on the other side of the battle line, critics, church leaders, and conservative media don't have time, or don't want, to distinguish those nuances. To them, the atheist, pranksters, the legal activists, or the esoteric philosophers, they are all lumped together in a labeled bag. Luciferians, the true henchmen of the devil. The blade of judgment has cut through all context, turning everything into a demonic tumor that needs to be eliminated. And this crazy labeling didn't just happen. It was ignited by one of history's greatest scams. Go back in time to the end of the 19th century. A French writer named Léo Taxil released a series of books and documents that shook the world, accusing the top leadership of the Freemasons of actually being a cult that worshipped Lucifer in secret. Taxil wove fictional characters and lewd, bloody rituals to the point that Catholic officials at the time trembled with anger and joy for having caught the enemy red-handed. Until 1897, when Taxil held a grand press conference in Paris, smiled insolently, and poured a bucket of cold water on everyone. His work was just a spectacular scam, a carefully staged hoax to embarrass the church. But oh, the irony of history. You think people would breathe a sigh of relief and forget? No. Taxil's confession couldn't kill the monster he had just created. The idea of a global elite secretly worshiping the devil had taken root too deeply. Taxil's forged quotes and fabricated rituals continued to spread like a virus, surviving through centuries, only to be brilliantly reborn in modern-day conspiracy theories. Entering the 20th and 21st centuries, Taxil's story donned a new suit, the New World Order. Millions today firmly believe there is a super powerful elite group pulling the global financial, political, and media strings. And of course, that elite group is called Luciferian. Vocabulary may have changed. Sometimes they are disguised as financiers or oligarchs, a subtle way to cover old toxic anti-Semitism. But the essence remains the same. Today, witch hunts don't happen in squares filled with oil-soaked wood. They are right on your smartphone screen, bloodshot eyes glued to music videos, scrutinizing every frame of Super Bowl or Grammy Award ceremonies. A star on a flag? An eye in a company logo? A slip of the tongue about enlightenment in a politician's speech? Boom! Irrefutable proof of loyalty to the satanic order. Coincidences and artistic designs are swapped for concepts. The term Luciferian no longer carries theological meaning. It has turned into a weapon of mass destruction, an all-encompassing accusation thrown at anyone, any organization, or any institution the crowd hates. And you know what makes this loop perfect? The actual presence of the Satanic Temple in real life, even if they are just civil rights activists exploiting legal loopholes. The sensationalist news reports about them become perfect puzzle pieces for conspiracy theorists. Paranoiacs look at the Satanic Temple and triumphantly scream, "See, the devil worshippers have stepped into the light." A single word carrying centuries of myth is now sandwiched between those who use it to demand freedom and those who use it to spread fear. The traces of Lucifer today are not in a sulfur lake of fire, but run along courtrooms, through lawsuits, and through streams of toxic conspiracy tweets spreading at the speed of light. You thought that was all the absurdity? Wait. The source of every bloody war, every social media-shaking conspiracy theory, it turns out to have originated from a stupid translation error by some scribes in the ancient past. Are you still there? Good. Because now, we are leaving the rooms overflowing with internet conspiracy theories to enter the scene of a real murder. The victim is none other than grammar. And the culprit? The laziness of translators from centuries ago. Take a deep breath, because I'm about to reveal a truth that might make the fanatics out there lose their minds. The entire bloody spiritual war, the loud lawsuits, and the horrors about a devil-worshipping elite. All of it broke out simply because people didn't know how to translate a name. That's right. Let's turn back the clock to the starting point of all the trouble, Isaiah 14:12 in the Old Testament. Imagine you are an ancient Hebrew poet standing in the scorching desert, watching the Babylonian kingdom crumble. You want to write a poem mocking the arrogant Babylonian king who has just died. You look up at the dawn sky and see Venus, the brightest star that rises before the sun appears, but is quickly swallowed by the sunlight. A brilliant metaphor. You call that king Hillel ben Shahar, shining one, son of the morning. There is no devil here. No horns, no tail. Just a mortal king being made into a laughingstock compared to an astronomical phenomenon. But then, the greatest game of telephone in history began. When Greek scholars set out to translate the Hebrew Bible into the Septuagint, they stumbled upon the phrase Hillel ben Shahar. They bit their pens, thought it over, and decided to use the word heosphoros, meaning bringer of dawn. Still very accurate, still just a star. Next, the Latin translation, the Vulgate, appeared. The Latin translators looked at the Greek word and chose a common noun in their language to refer to the morning star, Lucifer, lowercase. This word was combined from lux, light, and fere, to bring. Lucifer simply meant light bringer, a normal Roman astronomical term for early morning Venus. At this point, Lucifer was not yet a proper name, let alone the Lord of Hell. It was innocent and pure in the literal sense of the word. And then disaster struck when the English language entered the game. When medieval and early modern translators, like those who compiled the Wycliffe Bible or the legendary King James Version, struggled with the text, they worked primarily from the Latin version. When they saw the word Lucifer, instead of translating its meaning into English as morning star, they did the worst thing possible. They got lazy. They copy-pasted that Latin word directly into the English print. And gifted it a prominent capital letter. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Boom! The moment that drop of ink dried on the paper, a monster was born. A common noun simply because it wasn't translated, petrified into a proper name. Add to that the theological legacy and the fiery verses of John Milton later on, and the name Lucifer was officially nailed to the image of the fallen angel. The original Hebrew, Greek, Latin linguistic chain was buried in darkness. The public imagination was completely hijacked. Now, leap to the modern era. Today's Bible scholars, armed to the teeth with linguistic knowledge, have looked straight at the original Hebrew and realized this silly mistake. New translations like the NIV, ESV, or NRSV have quietly corrected it. They returned the original meaning to the verse. Instead of calling out the name Lucifer, they use morning star or shining one. An obvious act of academic correction, right? But alas, for the KJV-only movement and internet conspiracy theorists, the disappearance of the name Lucifer from modern Bibles is like an act of war. They scream on forums, they slam tables in criticism. They see this as a monstrous conspiracy to hide Satan, a sign of spiritual corruption in the end times. The irony is cruelly sharp. They are spending their lives protecting a Latin translation error. And even more ridiculous, this hysteria has led to a theological paradox that, if understood, would make many people blush. Do you know where else the morning star appears? In the New Testament. And it is an extremely, extremely sacred title. In 2 Peter 1:19, a morning star rises in the hearts of believers. And the climax is in the book of Revelation 22:16, where Jesus Christ himself declares, I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star. Wait, take a sip of water. Do you realize what is happening? In the ancient Latin Vulgate Bible, the same common noun Lucifer, morning star, was used for both the mocked Babylonian king in the Old Testament and to honor Jesus in the New Testament. For those who understood Latin at the time, this was completely normal. No contradiction, because Lucifer was just a brilliant symbolic object, not the name of an evil deity. But for today's keyboard warriors who have been brainwashed that Lucifer equals Satan, assigning morning star to both Jesus and the fallen figure in Isaiah makes their brains short-circuit. Online meme makers began a deceptive game of photo collaging. They placed the two verses side by side, intentionally creating a smokescreen, implying that modern translations are calling Jesus Lucifer or are secretly worshiping the devil. The peak of this absurdity explodes every year during Catholic Easter, around an ancient hymn called the Exultet. During the Easter Vigil, when the sacred candle is lit, priests sing a prayer in Latin, Flammas aius Lucifer matutinus inveniat, illa inquam Lucifer qui nescit occasum, Christus filius tuus. The grammar is clear as day. The hymn compares Christ to a Lucifer matutinus, a morning star that never sets. But on TikTok, YouTube, and underground conspiracy groups, what do? They snip off the clause, Christus filius tuus, Christ, your son, and throw it in the trash. They keep only the word Lucifer, play some creepy background music, and wail, look, the Pope is singing hymns to worship Satan right in the middle of the Vatican. A blatant lie, born from ignorance of linguistic history, stripped of context, and regurgitated by millions of mouths hungry for sensation. We have reached the end of the road. Let's look back at what we have. From a simple astronomical metaphor for a Middle Eastern king who died thousands of years ago, slipping through the lazy minds of translators, molded by the pens of great poets, and finally pimped out by pop culture into a suit-wearing drifter solving crimes on TV. That name continues to be stolen by social activists who like to show off and becomes an excuse for paranoiacs to raise the banner of a holy war against an illusory elite. All of it just because of one Latin word. The darkness of history does not lie in invisible supernatural forces, my friend. The real darkness lies in human credulity, in the way we are ready to distort words to serve our own fears and dramas. Next time someone whispers in your ear about the Lucifer conspiracy, just smile, hand them a Latin dictionary, and tell them to go look at Venus in the morning. Do you see this mess? Millions of people out there are living in extreme fear because of it. They look at a sparkling Super Bowl stage, a writhing Grammy performance, or even just a breakfast cereal box, and they see the claws of an underground force. They call it the Luciferian elite, the New World Order, those who are supposedly sitting in the shadows, pulling humanity's strings and swearing allegiance to the Lord of Hell using secret codes. It's thrilling. It's cinematic, just like a Hollywood blockbuster. But do you know what's even scarier and more ironic than a secret society aiming to dominate the world with black magic? It is linguistic ignorance. And today, we are going to debunk one of the biggest dramas in history: how a harmless, poetic common noun was inflated into the name of a powerful devil, and how that silly confusion became the cornerstone for modern-day conspiracy theories. Brace yourself, because this truth is going to shatter a few illusions. Let me take you back in time, back to the starting point of all the trouble, the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, written in the ancient Hebrew language. Here, we find a poem, not a dark spell, but a mockery, a biting political satire aimed directly at the arrogance of a mortal king in the ancient Near East. Scholars generally believe it was the king of Babylon. The author used a very rare Hebrew word, Hallel. Hallel comes from a linguistic root meaning to shine. Ancient people used it to depict the brightest light in the sky at dawn. That's right, the morning star. The metaphor is extremely simple. You were as brilliantly proud as the morning star, but now you have fallen from the sky. Period. No horned devil, no bat wings, no deadly smell of sulfur here. It's just poetry. But then, words are like people. They have to travel. And that's when everything started to go off the rails. Hallel was translated into Greek, and then it met a fateful turn. The Latin translation of the Bible, known as the Vulgate. The Latin translators looked at Hallel, scratched their chins, and searched for a word in their language to describe the Lightbringer, or morning star. What was that word? It was Lucifer. Surprise. At that time, Lucifer was absolutely not a name. It wasn't capitalized at all. It was just a small common noun in the Roman vocabulary for the sky. You look up and see the morning star twinkling. You call it Lucifer. Simple as that. In fact, the irony reached its peak if you attended an ancient Easter Vigil Mass. You would hear the Exultate chant in Latin, where the solemn liturgical language uses this very word, Lucifer, to praise Christ. Yes, you heard that right. Christ is honored as the bringer of light, the true morning star that never sets. Can you imagine the faces of today's YouTube researchers when they read that part? They would immediately howl, "Oh my God, the church is openly honoring Satan during Easter." And that, my friends, is the devastating power of hindsight bias. Once Lucifer has been frozen in the public imagination through centuries of art and literature, becoming the official fixed name of the devil, then every appearance or disappearance of it becomes a shady conspiracy theory. When modern Bible translation committees who understand Hebrew well decide to retranslate that phrase as morning star for accuracy, the internet roars. They are secretly erasing Lucifer from the Bible to cover up the truth. Conversely, when some ancient church still keeps Latin texts with the word Lucifer, that same crowd screams, "See? Clear evidence that they are worshiping the devil." Whether keeping the Latin version or translating the Hebrew literally, every choice is forced into a single command code through the lens of paranoia. These people don't care about centuries of linguistic evolution. They don't give a damn about the fact that a word traveled from a mockery through Greek, through Latin, and only then froze into the name of the devil in English culture. No. The historical record is too complex and boring for them. They want a monster. And if the historical truth doesn't satisfy that thirst, they will mold a Luciferian elite out of their own ignorance. But how did this linguistic hallucination evolve into a crazy symbol-finding machine scanning every corner of pop culture? Hold on to your seats. Textual history seems too boring, doesn't it? A word traveling through Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and becoming a name. Oh, who has time to read books? The story of the Luciferian elite on the internet looks much cooler. Here, Lucifer does not rest obediently on parchment pages. It lies at the center of a shooting game where the target is constantly moving. Welcome to the workshop of the symbol finding machine. See how this machine works. A content creator, oh, I love that fancy title, sits in a basement, piecing together a string of completely unrelated images. A banknote, an aerial photo of government buildings, milk carton packaging, or an actor's accidental wink. Each image is brutally paused. Circles and arrows start pointing. Here is a star, there is a triangle. That over there is a torch. And then a deep voiceover rises, or a bright red text hits your eyes, whispering that these traces are an oath of allegiance to a hidden Luciferian order. To increase the drama, they throw in a few Bible verses or Latin liturgical quotes that I just told you about in part 16, cutting them ruthlessly out of context, using them as steel evidence to claim that the architect or graphic designer is secretly sacrificing their soul rather than simply liking that geometric shape. What do you see here? A 5-pointed star on a national flag. Historically, it represents the military, or is simply a beautiful, abstract, geometric proportion. But through this grinder, it becomes the seal of Satan. And this, the all-seeing eye. Art history calls this the divine eye. the eye of God always watching the world, or the vigilance of a republic. But in the coding handbook of internet detectives, that long history is thrown in the trash. It is reduced to a single eye, the brand stamping membership in a hypothetical Luciferian network. Even the brilliant rays of light behind a statue, a classic symbol of enlightenment and victory, are twisted into a welcome for the morning star. Every familiar shape is transformed from an innocent design element into a deadly clue. But you know what's really ridiculous? Our own imagination has trapped us. We feed this machine with our own visual prejudices. For centuries, art has taught us what the devil looks like. A hideous horned demon from the Middle Ages, a powerful tempter in flamboyant operas, or a stylish anti-hero smirking in comics and TV shows. We are programmed to expect those colors, those shapes, those poses. So when you, a viewer whose head is stuffed with those stereotypes, happen to see a torch held high, a stylized set of wings on a singer trying to show off on stage, or a star pattern in a corporate logo, your brain immediately screams, "Bingo!" The boundary between an intentional artistic reference and unconscious borrowing, or a pure coincidence, is completely erased. It all gets tossed into the evidence pile of the machine. And most ridiculously, the peak of historical irony is that there are phantom scams from the 19th century still directing the script for the 21st century. Let's talk about Leo Taxiel. In the late 1800s, this fraudulent journalist made up a shocking story about secret Freemasons worshiping Lucifer with the most absurd Palladian rituals he could concoct. The purpose? To annoy and mock the Catholic Church. Taxiel then stood before a crowd and burst out laughing, publicly confessing that it was all a spectacular hoax, a cheap play. But guess what? More than a century later, those fake speeches and rituals woven from the diseased imagination of a confessed fraud are being copied, pasted, and spread on thousands of leaflets and online posts. They are placed prominently next to screenshots of modern logos worshipped as oracles of truth. A staged prank has turned into a divine piece in the mosaic of paranoia. And who is the one lighting the fuse for this crazy bomb? It is the very online ecosystem that you use every day. The search for symbols invites you to do something very unnatural. Pause, rewind, and scrutinize every pixel of frames that were meant to flash by in the blink of an eye. The more time you spend glued to those red circles, the more the algorithms, those soulless monsters that don't care about the truth, happily serve you a buffet of identical content. Each recommended clip drives another needle into your brain, reinforcing a terrifying hallucination that symbols are everywhere, that every arrow points in a single direction, toward a self-proclaimed Luciferian elite, even though in the real world, no powerful organization would slap such a stupid label on its own forehead. But if Luciferian is not a real organization, then why are people so obsessed with it? Are they really afraid of the devil, or are they borrowing his name to cover up a much darker fear? You see, this is exactly how the brain of the internet processes information. Welcome to the greatest boundary-blurring art of the century. We do not deny the existence of things that actually bear these labels. Yes, out there are religious and philosophical organizations that call themselves Satanist or Luciferian. Most of them are atheists using this symbol to fight for individual freedom or to annoy conservative movements. Yes, the word Lucifer really does sit right there in ancient Bible prints and the Exultet hymn. And of course, villains named Lucifer are ubiquitous on Netflix. But the conspiracy machine does not have time to distinguish those subtle nuances. They throw it all into one place. The distinction between atheist philosophy, the use of Latin vocabulary in history, and a fictional character on TV is crushed. Since when did Luciferian, a term that was supposed to refer only to a specific, albeit eccentric belief system, transform into a universal sticker, a cheap slang term used to throw at anything that looks elite, global, polished, or simply unfamiliar? Political rivals, Luciferian, tech billionaires, Luciferian, an international health organization, definitely Luciferian, a global climate treaty, absolutely a Luciferian ritual. Do you realize the rhetorical magic trick happening here? Applying this devilish label doesn't actually describe a real belief. No, it is a psychological defense mechanism, a way to compress dozens of complex, massive fears of modern humans into a single, easy-to-pronounce, and dramatic word. We are living in a chaotic world where globalization sweeps through every corner, secularization breaks traditional orders, and a sense of loss of control strangles small local people. They are afraid of macroeconomic policies they don't understand. They tremble before the algorithms manipulating their lives. And you know what? Blaming a complex trade treaty is too boring and requires you to have knowledge. But pointing a finger at a politician and wailing, "He is participating in a secret sacrifice ritual pulled by the devil's strings." Oh, that is incredibly easy. Dry debates about policy, economy, or governance suddenly turn into a holy war against shadow worship. Standing from a historian's perspective, the gap between the trash on the internet and the textual history of this name is so vast, it's ridiculous. Look at the real record of Lucifer. It is dense, rich, and can be clearly traced to its source. Every step of its journey is date-stamped and placed in a specific context. We have Isaiah's mockery in the 8th century BC. We have Dante's frozen giant at the bottom of hell. We have the cunning strategist in Milton's epic. We have the 19th century radical newspapers proudly printing the word Lucifer in giant letters on the front page as a symbol of resistance against the oppression of church and state. We have dozens of stage scripts, comics, and even the confession of Leo Taxile's hoax. All of these things are history. It is flexible, it is complex, and it is full of human meaning. But what about the symbol finding machine on the internet? Does it bother to read this book? Of course not, it's too lazy. It just reaches its hand into history, plucks out one or two Bible verses, a stray line of Latin, grabs a pile of Taxile's fake texts, and ties them all together with cheap rope to an ever-expanding list of corporate logos. The name Lucifer is just an anchor for a fictional story. Evidence showing that an organized Luciferian elite is running the world simply does not exist in the real world. It only exists in the way people interpret and distort images. But don't be quick to mock those who believe in these conspiracy theories. Exposing the historical truth does not make their fear disappear. The concerns about the concentration of ruthless power, total technological surveillance, deep financial inequality, they are real, very real. It's just that the language they use to express that fear has gone out of sync, lost in stars and torches. The Luciferian elite is not a cult. It is a modern myth, a fictional monster created to give shape and a face to invisible anxieties about power. Humans need a devil to blame, and they have borrowed a figure with a massive literary history to be the scapegoat. But when textual history and internet hallucinations finally face each other at the crossroads, what will happen? Wait and see how the final split will expose our true faces. We have reached the crossroads where Lucifer's legal file is officially torn in half. Look to my right. This is the provable path. A vocabulary for the morning star, zigzagging theological evolutions, a pile of artistic conventions, and folders of clearly recorded records of groups and hoaxes with dated receipts. Now, look to the left. A crazy collage, shimmering with cropped screenshots and tangled diagrams. In this territory, Luciferian is not a noun. It is a slang term, a giant trash can to hold everything humanity feels disgusted by and untrusting of regarding modern power. Both of these worlds use the same name. Both tear at the same set of images. But only on one side can you actually follow every trace of printer's ink through the centuries. Imagine this word as an ink stain. Initially, it sat quietly, harmlessly in a verse of the book of Isaiah, a mockery of an arrogant king. But then that ink stain spread. It became a common noun in the astronomical vocabulary of the Greeks and Romans. It resonated in hymns. It was forced down into captions beneath horrific medieval paintings. It incarnated as a human-like devil in Milton's epic. It transformed into a demonic title in sorcery books. A name screamed in horrific witch trials. And then, it sat prominently on the front pages of rebel newspapers. A symbol of resistance. On a timeline, you think it's a straight line? Not at all. Zorro waves his hand, phantom files scatter around him. It's like a stack of soaked case files. Ink from one page saturates and bleeds into the next. Each era picks a slice of the file, freezes something that was inherently very flexible, forces it into a harder outline, and leaves the rest to sink into darkness. Humans are so creative, aren't they? As the witch trials spread, the great minds of that time dragged Lucifer down from the distant sky into the mud of daily life. They drew bureaucratic charts for hell. They appointed Lucifer as emperor, ruling over demonic dukes and counts. Suddenly, every failed harvest, dead pig, storm, or simple neighborly quarrel was a trace of the hell administration at work. Lucifer was dragged into barns, kitchens, and hayfields through myths about soul-selling contracts. Modern culture has dressed him in new outfits, the stylish tempter in musicals, the weary administrator, or a suit-wearing anti-hero with a glass of bourbon in his hand on TV. We gave him a voice, a smirk, a set of gestures. And then the internet conspiracy theorists grabbed all that mess, threw it into a press, and squeezed out a command code. Everything bad about global organizations is Lucifer. In this corner, look at an ancient scribe. He is bent over, carefully lowering his quill onto an expensive parchment page, meticulously writing each letter of the word Lucifer, a tiny, solitary act. That text will take months, years to travel through scriptoriums and pulpits. In that corner, a cyber detective of today. Screen light casts on a pale face. The mouse cursor blinks threateningly in the search bar. Fingers type frantically LUCIFERIANELITE. Press enter. Also a tiny act. But in a millisecond, that query rips through servers, crawls into algorithms, and explodes on millions of timelines globally. The scale of the network has given these small individuals a reach so far that they themselves cannot understand its destructive power. The truth is, the figure at the center of this mess, Lucifer, has hardly changed at all. What changes, what is always transforming, are our anxieties. In the Age of Kings, he was the lesson in pride. In the Age of shaky faith, he was the explanation for why evil exists. In the years of hysteria, he was the fear of magic and heresy. And today, he wears the face of fear in a world controlled by surveillance technology, global governance, and brutal inequality. The history of Lucifer is not the biography of a devil. It is a cross-section of the human psyche. It shows how language slips terrifyingly from a pure description of nature to a multi-layered symbol, and finally to a poisonous accusation. The distance between what the word Lucifer once named in that clear sky and what people today think it is revealing on their phone screens is the measure of history's hysteria. This case, my friends, is still open because tomorrow there will be new posts, new videos dragging this name into other dark pits. I am Zorro, and this is Dark History. See you in the next dark corners of history.